Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about Legion in the Many Lives of Stephen Leeds by Brandon Sanderson, and this entire idea of psychology as superpower. It's very much tied to Brandon Sanderson's magic systems and a few other popular magic systems. So I kind of want to talk about it along with talking about this collection of short stories, I'll call it. So yeah, as always, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And if you haven't already, feel free to check out the Patreon. The link is in the description. So with that being said, let's begin. All right, so Legion by Brandon Sanderson. The Many Lives of Stephen Leeds. So I really kind of like this book. I think it's a lot of fun. I hesitate to really call it a book because it's really just a collection of short stories. There are so there are like three main stories in here, and honestly, my favorite one is the second one. It is the longest story in it, and it is like the most in depth. So I kind of want to talk about this and talk about the psychology of superpower or the psychology as superpower a little bit. I want to talk about both of those concepts. So first off, let's kind of talk about the psychology of superpower a bit. So it closely is related, of course, to The Many Lives of Stephen Leeds, because that's exactly the premise that Brandon basically worked the story off of. It's this idea of a person having a kind of pseudo version of dissociative identity disorder, but it's really a coping mechanism for essentially his, massive genius. So this idea of using this condition, or at least a fictitious version of it, dissociative identity disorder, is not uncommon, at least these days, in terms of translating it as a superpower or something like that. So there is basically many characters that have this condition that basically tie into their superpowers. So from Marvel Comics, the son of Charles Xavier, David Haller, he has multiple names oftentimes, but he is also called Legion. And ironically, that adaptation of that character, the channel FX made a TV show version for the X-Men character Legion, who has the exact same mental condition or similar mental condition as Stephen Leeds does. And ironically, around the time when Hollywood was trying to option this short story as a movie, they were already working on that X-Men property. So because of the fact that there's a Marvel property called Legion, Brandon Sanderson's property called Legion didn't get a TV show adaptation. So I found that very hilarious, but also very ironic and a little disappointing. But not very disappointing because, to be honest, I would like one of Brandon's first things, to get introduced to the wider normie world, to probably be something like Mistborn or something. I wanted to be something, one of his really good ones to be the first intro to all the regular people apart from all of us. So yeah, but that's neither here nor there. Yes, the story of Legion, the Marvel character, not the Brandon Sanderson book. He is a mutant. He has, natural abilities based on his DNA as being an evolved human as a mutant, but he has multiple abilities. He has like numerous abilities. He has pretty much all the abilities, but each ability is tied to one of his aspects, one of his different personalities. So one personality will be telekinetic, another will be telepathic, and so on and so forth. There's also another character in DC called Crazy Jane. She has the exact same situation. She has multiple personalities, and each personality has its own unique special ability. So this kind of idea of having multiple personalities and those personalities having abilities or having specific functions is not uncommon, because honestly it's very easily tied to the condition itself, because most people, when they describe DID, people with the actual condition, unlike numerous people on the internet now that will fake it because it went through this weird popularity thing. Those people will often describe it as each personality, each kind of aspect having a specific function. Sometimes they'll be aware of the functions, and other times they will only become aware of the functions through therapy and stuff like that. But it seems like a lot of those ideas and concepts were kind of molded in to Brandon's ideas when he came up with Legion, Stephen Leeds, the Stephen Leeds story. So Stephen Leeds is actually quite different than these other characters because he does not actually have dissociative identity disorder. The closest thing he will claim is something like schizophrenia, because he doesn't have unique separate personalities. He basically has what he calls aspects. They are hallucinations that essentially govern and hold on to specific information that he can't consciously deal with in his own brain, essentially. He's essentially a hyper genius, but has so much information that he can't really store it as, I guess, anybody else typically would. Like he can't just make a filing system in his head or anything. So the way his situation kind of created it, it was that like he will read a book. Like say he'll read a book about handwriting expertise or whatever, and then he creates an aspect who will hold all that information about that subject and all that knowledge, and it will basically kind of separate from his conscious cognitive forefront mind. So it will basically live in that aspect, and that'll be the main function of that aspect at any time. So anytime he needs that information, he's essentially talking to a separate person that like has a greater expertise in the skill in the in that area of expertise. So it's kind of an interesting, different way of doing dissociative identity. It very much feels like categorizing and storing knowledge. It gives me a little bit of ferrochemical kind of energy. Like it kind of gives me a little bit of that vibe, a little bit. So I almost want to attribute some of the ideas that Brandon had in this story contributing to the way in which ferrochemy works in the Mistborn series. So when I was looking into like different psychological conditions that are expressed as superpowers, dissociative identity disorder is one of the most common ones. There are numerous characters with the condition that will often have multiple abilities because it's kind of a one-to-one kind of setup thing. But there's many other characters that will often have powers that are associated with their mental health that go outside of they live mostly in comic books because that's where the majority of superpowers in media are. But there's the show Gen V. It is a spinoff of the show The Boys. It's an Amazon production. And two of the main characters, actually most of the main characters in the show, their powers are expressed through various psychological conditions. It's not the entire limitation of their ability that it's totally tied to their psychological condition, but it is basically it informs on it. So for example, the main character Marie, she has what is basically what is it? I think it'll be like hemokinesis, hemoglobin. I don't know, telekinesis. She has the ability. She's a bloodbender. Like from Avatar. She has the ability to control blood, whether it's inside a person's body or outside of a person's body. But she also grew up as an orphan, and she has trauma based on the way her powers manifest and everything. So a lot of the way she will practice her ability has to do with cutting herself. So she will often basically self-harm in order to more easily make use of her abilities, even though she doesn't have to. It's just kind of this way in which she conditions herself to use her abilities until, character development happens. Similar to another character. They have the ability to shrink and grow and stuff like that. But their power only essentially works through eating disorder. So they essentially have to basically figure out another way to trigger their ability outside of the eating disorder. So it kind of ties in their character development to the story development to understanding their abilities. And I think that method is probably the best method to use this idea of psychology as superpower, because in a lot of scenarios, if you do that, you kind of lessen the severity of the psychological condition if it's a severe one, or you kind of take, it kind of makes it can make like some serious psychological conditions seem more fun, almost, that kind of thing, like kind of giving a bit of the wrong impression to a reader or to an audience. On the flip side of that, you can use the same idea to rehabilitate the reputation of certain conditions. Like Rick Riordan used ADHD and dyslexia as a major marker in his Heroes of Olympus and Percy Jackson series. If you have ADHD and dyslexia, those are markers that you're a half-blood, that you're a demigod. So he kind of ties it into like the hero's journey. It's actually literally a marker of your, super heritage or whatever, however you want to say it. So it's kind of an interesting thing that he goes into that. So I really appreciate the idea of psychology as superpower because, again, as I said, the way in which it can massage the reputation of certain conditions, but it also like plays a part in rooting a character's abilities when it's a magic system based kind of story into their psychology, which automatically kind of ties the character development to the magic system development, and that's kind of a two birds one stone sort of thing that I really really enjoy. So to talk a little bit about Stephen Leeds, I think this story is very, very cool, and it's kind of, I don't know if it was within the same time period, but that secret fifth project that Brandon released, the very short story of that detective story he did, It kind of gives me a little bit of that energy. So I'm wondering if this is from a similar time period when he was writing these, because this is very much a detective story. Stephen Leeds is a private investigator. He takes on very specialized cases, basically to make use of his different aspects in order to be able to figure things out. He's like incredibly rich because he's like an amazing detective. This is something similar to like Death Note. I in my head I automatically think of him as a detective character like L. L is the main foil of the main character in Death Note. He is this hyper genius detective. Like he just makes deductive leaps that are short, like nothing short of magic, quite frankly. And Stephen Leeds is kind of similar. So I really like that idea, like this idea of a detective who takes on these types of jobs and things, but he just basically has a insane staff behind him. He has a staff of like 46 people that have all major different specialities and things, and it's just really really fascinating. A lot of the cases he kind of deals with are very like straightforward. I almost want to call them run of the mill. They're pretty interesting, but they're I mean, I guess it's not novel length interesting, so I guess to me it's just kind of, oh, that's kind of cool, and I just kind of move on. But it kind of introduces these interesting little fantastical elements to the world. So like in the first story we find out that there's a camera that can take pictures of the past, like somehow or another. Like it works in such a way where it can take pictures of the past. It has mostly to do with the bulb that's used. And basically at the end of that story they end up in a situation where the camera is destroyed, but he still has the bulb, and Steven wants to understand like how it worked and everything. So he reads a book on quantum physics and time and stuff, and then creates a personality or an aspect that has all that information locked there, so that that aspect can basically go and study what happens to the point where they eventually rebuild the camera. So it's kind of a really interesting thing, and it kind of makes me think how it works mechanically, like, does that other aspect just like, is it off researching? Like if the aspect is off researching, is that Steven researching later and implanting that information into the aspect, or is this like a subconscious part of his brain that's like digging further into the information he's already consumed before he made the aspect? Like there's just some mechanical parts to it that I'm very curious about, which is also why the second story and the three stories is my favorite, because that story has to do with this interesting idea of writing data onto human cells and in human bacteria and stuff. It's a concept that's real in real life, but the level of advancement it is in the story makes it feels a little sci-fi, a little magical, a little kind of a little supernatural, a little extra. So I really like that. But the thing about that short story that I like the most is the exploration we get of his aspects. So all of his aspects kind of like function like this big dysfunctional family and stuff, and I really like it. But we get a little bit more detail about how it works with Steven. So Steven has basically has a difficult time manifesting like too many of his aspects at the same time, because his basically, which is another piece of evidence that goes against this idea of him having dissociative identity disorder, because apparently if he manifests multiple, like more than like 10 aspects or whatever at a time, it becomes incredibly difficult for him. Like he gets tired and stuff, and like it creates this level of mental fatigue. So he has what he calls the white room, which is literally a room that's just like all white, completely void of all distractions and any sort of attention grabbing thing. So essentially he can completely focus and manifest multiple aspects, like upwards of 10 or more or whatever. I don't think he ever manifests all 46 or 7 of them or whatever. Like the number also kind of fluctuate because some disappear, and he also one of his aspects has a husband who she seems to independently manifest, which is just in and of itself very fascinating. So there's just a lot of different things that happen in the story that are specifically central to the way in which Stephen Leeds' psychology works. And to me, that's the most interesting part of the story. The way in which we kind of hear about there's a bunch of academics that are always hounding him, trying to like study about him more and stuff, like to the point where he gets asked on this, he basically gets lied to. He thinks he has a client and he's going to go try to figure out what the person needs help with and stuff, what's the case and everything. But it's really a college student trying to do a research paper on him and basically having lied and said that they, needed a case, had a case and all this kind of stuff. So I think that kind of thing is was really fascinating. This idea of this character who is like on paper, what a lot of people would immediately think is that he's like psychotic or something, or not even psychotic, but just, mentally unstable. And he's actually like incredibly stable. But then there's also an aspect that, like, instead of having this situation where all of his mental condition essentially works as just a superpower with no drawbacks, we do get an illustration of a situation that can completely paralyze him. So he basically behaves in such a way where all his aspects are physical manifestations. So he like will open car doors for them, or and he will ask his butler to bring them coffee and stuff like that too, different refreshments or whatever. So he ends up in a situation where he's held at gunpoint, and the person that has the gun tells him to get out of the car because basically they make him believe that they're going to go somewhere else. So he opens the door and lets his aspects out, but then she hurries up and slams the door closed and then tells the person that's driving the car to drive. So effectively, she leaves his aspects behind. So like three of them or whatever just like left on the street. And to his perspective, he's looking out the back of the car and seeing his aspects being left on the side of the road. So he ends up in this scenario where he has no idea how to function. Because one of the aspects is like his the one where he puts all his self-defense and his paranoia and self-preservation and all those kind of things. It's where he puts, it's all in that aspect. So that aspect isn't with him. So that aspect can't tell him what to do, how to, how to be, how to deal. So he's really just sitting here in his car in this whole scenario just completely paralyzed. Without his aspects, he doesn't seem to like have access to any of the information that is actually in his head. So I really like the fact that it's like, yes, this is a cool kind of ability that he has. It's a really cool compartmentalization situation he's in. But ultimately, he can be paralyzed by it. It has this major, major weakness to it. And the fact that he doesn't keep any of it secret is like, it makes him incredibly vulnerable. And the fact that he doesn't kind of hack it either, like as much as he could, like continues to make him vulnerable. Because as they're driving away, he kind of notices that his self-preservation and his the fighter, JD, I believe his name is, the fighter aspect is like running after the car and like keeping up and stuff. And they're going like no less than 50 miles an hour. And based on his own perception, he is just kind of there, and he's like, "Oh, okay, finally, like, yeah, he's keeping up." And then another one of his aspects that didn't get out of the car in time, she mentions the fact, "Wow, he's running so fast," and it literally hit Stephen at that moment that he's running way faster than any person would be able to. And as soon as he realizes that, it affects the aspect, and he starts to slow down, and then he stops, and he's like winded and stuff, and he can't catch up to the car. So that to me like introduces this interesting aspect, in that if he can effectively lie to himself, his aspects could have superpowers, like true superpowers. Like JD could have been flying behind the car or something. So that's just really fascinating. So in my own head, I was like, I mean, I guess it's because the way in which they manifest for him, the way in which he kind of follows all physical world rules and where they're concerned and stuff, like giving them refreshments, making sure the butler also brings them their coffee or tea or whatever, opening the door for them, making sure when he goes to a restaurant, he has somewhere that seats like 6, even if it's only 2 of them, like all that kind of stuff. So like just the greater way in which he manifests them, like just contextually, the way he does it in such a physical way, it creates this drawback that he basically has to deal with. And I think that's really, really fascinating. I just think that like this is a really cool kind of idea to play with. And I think Brandon did a really good job playing with it, with these 3 kind of simple stories that are just detective stories. And me personally, I would really enjoy kind of a crossover between this character and the detective character we get in that short story, where he's like speaking, Dick Tracy 1920s detective slang. I would really like that, because that's a hyper futuristic world. And some of the stuff that happens in these stories very much feels like it could be a hyper realistic world, like taking pictures of the past and like all the kind of stuff that they do in this. Like, if this world could be interesting enough that I would love to see like a buddy cop situation between these 2 characters, somebody who's stuck in 1920s detective stuff and somebody who's a whole crowd of people all on its own and just a hyper genius. Like, it would just be like a lot of fun to cross over those 2 ideas. I would really, really enjoy it, I think. Ironically, in this video talking about psychology as superpower, I managed to not talk about Stormlight Archive. So that's kind of cool. So I might actually do a follow-up video, though, psychology as superpower and how the Stormlight Archive utilizes the idea of it. Yeah, that's a long-winded title, but that still sounds like a title, so I'm probably going to do that anyway. So yeah. All right, yeah, this is the end of this nice little rambly video I just wanted to put out here for all of you. Have you all read Legion by Brandon Sanderson? You notice my little sticker on there. That's a Walmart purchase for you. Um, so yeah, let me know in the comments down below if you've read Legion. How do you think Brandon did with the psychologist superpower idea? And if you haven't read Legion, just let me know what you think about the concept in general before we talk about it in Stormlight in a later video. Let me know how you think, what you think about just the idea of psychology as superpower. Do you think it's a great idea, or if it's murky and has like some weird areas in which it can be kind of dangerous to trod? Let me know your opinions about all that stuff in the comments down below. So as always, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and check out the Patreon if you're interested. And as always, I will talk to you all next time. Peace.